Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion. I'm Aretha Lafayette, Program Manager for Research Education Program Development and Outreach in the Office of Research and Innovation. I will serve as the session MC for today's discussion. Before we begin this program, we would like to make a land acknowledgement. UT Dallas stands on land originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche people. We recognize the legacy of colonization and the harm caused by the forced removal of indigenous people from these lands. UT Dallas continues to benefit from the contributions of indigenous students and employees on our campus, and we are committed to ongoing support for the Native culture that is essential to our community. For more information on the history of the land UT Dallas occupies, the Caddo Confederacy, and relevant treaties, please visit the Multicultural Center website. Allow me to introduce Emily Lacey, Director of Sponsored Projects. Emily joined the University of Texas at Dallas staff in 2010. Prior to UTD, she spent 5 years in the Central Research Office and 1 year in the Corporate and Foundation Relations Office at University of North Texas. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aretha. During today's talk show, which is about NSF Grant Opportunities for Academic Liaison with Industry Awardees, commonly known as GOALI, our panelists will share best practices for proposal submission, including the importance of coupling research objectives with both education and industrial needs. Our first panelist is Dr. Mark Lee. He is a professor of physics and materials science and an affiliated faculty member in the Texas Analog Center of Excellence, TexACE, at UT Dallas. Professor Lee received his PhD in applied physics from Stanford University, and prior to UT Dallas, he held faculty and research staff and management positions at the University of Virginia, Bell Laboratories, and Sandia National Labs. Professor Lee's research focuses on the electrodynamic and quantum mechanical properties of novel materials, nanomaterials, and electronic devices. Professor Lee is a past head of the physics department here at UT Dallas, past manager of the science department at Sandia Center for Integrated Nanotechnologies, past chair of the American Physical Society's Forum on Industrial and Applied Physics, and a fellow of the American Physical Society for his research accomplishments in solid-state physics. Dr. Lee, please tell us a little bit about your GOALI projects so we know what we're in for.
I guess I have held 3 GOALI awards. I currently hold 1 in here, all with colleagues at Texas Instruments. And I first was introduced to my Texas Instruments collaborators, Dr. Hal Edwards and Dr. Tathaga Chatterjee, through TexACE here at UT Dallas. And I guess Professor Ken O, who heads TexACE, back in 2011 or 2012, just introduced me to these folks at TI, and then things grew kind of organically. I talked quite a bit with them. We discussed what we were interested in. We finally landed on a mutual interest in quantum mechanical electron transport in semiconductors, something I had done in other contexts in the past, and which these folks at TI had some interest in trying to adapt to their silicon product line. And so that was the birth of the first GOALI proposal that got funded in here. And that was probably 2013 or so. And Texas Instruments fabricated all of the devices for us in there, and we worked very closely with them as well in characterizing them and figuring out all the things that happened. Subsequent to that, more discussions with essentially the same research group or same research cohort at Texas Instruments. They approached me at one point and asked me whether I knew anything about thermoelectrics. And I told them, no, I did not know anything about thermoelectrics, but it sounded interesting and I was willing to learn. That ultimately led to a discussion which came across as the second 2 GOALI awards, one on applied thermoelectrics and the current one we have, which is actually much more physics oriented, scientifically oriented, on the physics of thermoelectric materials and thermodynamics in general. But as all of these have been, just basically through very close discussions with folks at TI about subjects of mutual interest or subjects where we thought something might be interesting both to me as a scientist and to them, in trying to think about what they might need in their product line, not next year or the year after, but 5 or 10 years from now.
Excellent, and that's a perfect segue into what exactly the GOALI program is, which is the marriage of the industry side and our research curiosity. All right, thank you. So now we move on to our next panelist, who is Dr. Arif Malik, joined the Mechanical Engineering Department at UTD in 2015. He was previously at St. Louis University, and before entering academia, he spent more than a decade working in industry, including in R&D, applications engineering, metals manufacturing, and 5 years in a process control startup company. Dr. Malik, please give us a little background on your GOALI experience.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I've had, I would say, 3 experiences with GOALI proposals. 2 of the proposals were funded. So I have 2 separate GOALI projects, and both of those were completed. And the third one was actually a collaborative GOALI. So it was 2 universities and an industry partner. And that one was actually recommended for funding, but we ran into some IP issues at the end. And so this is one of the things that I plan to talk about as an area of emphasis to really make sure that anybody considering a GOALI proposal understands regarding IP. So, but my projects, the first one was with a heavy equipment manufacturer. It was in the manufacturing area. And we sent graduate students to work on site at the company. It was very nice. And that came about basically as a result of some of the work I did early on as an assistant professor. The second one was with a high-speed machining company, machining aerospace materials. And I met a chief engineer actually at an NSF workshop. He was invited to talk about machining technologies at an NSF workshop, and so we found we had some common interests, and we kept in touch. And as we communicated, we found that his needs, research needs, were aligned with my research interests, and then eventually we formed a GOALI collaboration, and we wrote a couple of proposals, and then eventually one was funded. And the third one, the lead was another university, but a couple of us here at UTD were invited to join. So it was a collaborative proposal, and that was with a company that was a fairly small company doing additive manufacturing. And as I mentioned, that one was a really big proposal. And in the end, we ran into IP issues, so it wasn't funded. So it was not really a good ending, but it was a good learning experience. And so hopefully I can share with you all some of those experiences today. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes, you'll give us some good tips and tricks. All right, our final panelist is Dr. Majid Manari, who is an associate professor of mechanical engineering at UT Dallas. His group is interested in materials processing and advanced manufacturing. Dr. Manari, tell us a little bit about your GOALI project, please.
Yes, thank you, Emily. So my GOALI came about kind of randomly. I was working in collaborating with another professor at UNT, and going back and forth several times. Eventually, he looked at some of the project I was doing, and he said, "Oh, I'm working with a company in Fort Worth that have a lot of interest in this topic." So one evening, we just drove there randomly. We met the president of the company, and we talked briefly. So from there on, it really took off, and we have been working with them, let's say now, close to 10 years, I would say. Even before this GOALI, we started doing other things with them, and eventually this GOALI, one of those product. But I think one of the most important aspect has been kind of mutual interest in different projects that have led to, as far as I know, 3 phase 1 and 2 phase 2 SBIRs with NASA and Department of Energy. And then in addition to that company, what happened, another company from Ohio contacted me a few years ago, and he said, we saw a presentation from that company in one of the, you have the company they have been working in one of the workshops. So we are interested to work with you. And then we started working with them, and we have had one SBI phase 1 and 1 phase 2. And so it's been really fruitful in terms of both the GOALI project itself, but also what we have been accomplished to do through other means, and even indirectly just getting a lot of the industrial ideas, think that industry is interested, and just bouncing ideas with them has been really helpful. Getting letter of support from the company, they have been helpful, although there have been challenges, admittedly, with anything else. So I look at it as something that has facilitated many other opportunities.
Awesome. Yes, we will touch on the SBIRs and STTRs a little bit later on all the options that you have once you make this connection. And it sounds like everybody had really good networking connections that led to these offshoots. And as you all stated, there are some challenges when you go from an education to the industry world, where the industry, everything is proprietary, and education where we want everything to be open source. So we'll talk a little bit about those challenges. The first question I have is, so the GOALI solicitation allows you to submit either as a brand new full proposal, or you can do it as a supplement to an existing award. It sounds like everyone had a brand new proposal. Is that correct? Or did anybody submit as a supplement to an existing award? Sounded like they were all new.
Yeah, all three of mine were new. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
all three of mine were new standalone proposals. Yes.
All right. Okay, so the next question is, was the GOALI an extension of an existing project, or was it a whole new direction and scope? So a whole brand new idea and everything. And did it come out of your relationships with the industry, or was it an idea that you were already working on? Let's start with Dr. Malik. Let's start with you.
Yeah, let me. I think it's different depending on the particular GOALI proposal I did. The first one was more a case of I knew what the needs of the industry were because it was an area of research for me, and I sort of knew the state of the art, and I approached them and said, you know, this could be something that if we can solve this problem, it may help you better understand the process, and I was able to convince them of that. The second one, as I mentioned, I met a chief engineer for this high-speed machining company at an NSF workshop, and we got an opportunity to speak. And one of the things that he was really interested in is, you know, residual stress and distortion of these machined parts, and it was sort of it was an area that I had done some work in, but I think you know, the reason it came about is because of the fact that he could tell that I understood his needs. And that's really important when you're, you know, of course, in the academic world, we want to get the funding, we want to publish, we want to get PhD students to work. But ultimately, if you have a GOALI partner, and this is where part of the challenges come in, you really have to understand what the industry motivation is for wanting to join the project. And so it was clear to me, I understood well his motivations, and it made it quite easy to join together. In the third case, it was really facilitated by another university, but they were looking for expertise that we could provide, and so they had already made the contact with the GOALI partner and sort of convinced them that we can put together a team that can really solve these difficult problems.
Okay, and Dr. Lee, you already addressed this a little bit in your introduction, that you, in the first GOALI project, it was something that you were already doing and you could find the connection with your Texas Instruments people. And then the third, I believe it was the third one, where it was kind of a new direction, but you got to learn that new direction while helping the company. Is that a good interpretation?
Yeah. Yes, I guess my first GOALI proposal and award, this was, like I said, 2012 or 2013, that grew out of discussions. I had experience in doing what we call quantum mechanical electron transport in semiconductors. Traditionally in physics, it's not done in silicon, it's done in somewhat more exotic materials. And several people I talked to at Texas Instruments were also interested in the same phenomenon, and they were wondering whether it could be adopted to their world, that is the world of silicon. And so that grew out of kind of a mutual interest thing. And then later, the next two GOALI projects I had, both having to do with thermoelectrics, that started when, you know, I had already developed good relationships with a lot of the researchers at TI. And so they came to me and they said, you know, we are interested in adapting thermoelectrics into our, you know, eventually someday into our product line. But the their corporate bosses thought that's way too far out for them to actually work on at TI, and so they were told, can you find an academic partner who can work on this much longer range, higher risk stuff, and we can provide at least some in-kind support and some expertise, and that's how it grew out of that. And what they pitched me sounded interesting. They gave me some prototype things they had already worked on for me to take a look at. We got a bunch of preliminary results on that and wrote a GOALI proposal that ended up being successful. And that kind of branched off into the third one, which is more or less a continuation of the second one, but interestingly enough, much less applied. My current GOALI proposal is on the same topic, but is much more fundamental or much more scientifically oriented than the previous ones.
That is interesting. And Dr. Minari, I believe you said that you already had your connection, and then y'all kind of found a way to match your interest. Do you have anything else to add about your proposal?
Right. I think the part that I would add is essentially the new changes that have been added to GOALI now. I think with the new changes, the company actually, as long as they are defined as a small business, they can get 1/3 of the total budget. We should remember that before that, it was I would say, a very difficult proposition because company essentially wouldn't get anything. So when I discussed that one eventually in the beginning with the company, their question is always, okay, what do we get, right? So we say, okay, we can have some postdoc and PhD student come visit, you guys come back and forth. So for me, the part that worked and they had the vision was that, okay, if we help you to kind of solve this fundamental problem with the interest and input from us, then we can go for further funding, which was the SBIR kind of incentive there, right? So I think it was a kind of a bigger picture in that sense. But I think nowadays with this 1/3 that company can get, it's kind of an easier proposition approaching company and saying that they can do that.
I agree. It gives you more of a leverage in. All right. So we talked about how y'all met your partners. How would you suggest if somebody was interested in going for a GOALI proposal, but they needed to find an industry partner? What would you suggest for how they could do that? What options would you suggest? Like we've talked about how you met some people at conferences. Do you have any other suggestions? Anybody want to go first?
I guess I will go first here. I guess all of my industrial collaborators work for Texas Instruments here, but TI obviously has an enormous presence on campus, particularly with the engineering school, because I know so many of my engineering colleagues, particularly in the electronic materials and circuits front, get funding directly from TI in here. So, trying to identify maybe somebody at TI who might have a common interest in what you are doing. Even if you don't know anyone in TI yourself, my advice would be to ask your UTD colleagues, especially again if you are in something like electrical engineering or material science, or nowadays biomedical engineering in here. Somebody knows somebody at TI and can put you in touch. And my experience has been that people are very happy to do that. Okay, give phone numbers, give email contacts, make introductions as well, and things like that. Even make personal introductions. At least pre-pandemic, that was very common in here. So just to ask. You can begin by asking the people at UTD. There are a lot of connections into TI all over the place.
Yes, I agree. And Dr. Malik, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I might recommend. I'm pursuing myself right now, actually. So if somebody has a PhD student that graduates and goes to work for a company, assuming that you know, what they're doing at the company is somewhat aligned with some of the PhD work. That's a great avenue as well. So it's always, you know, working with a company is as much about relationships as it is about the technical work. And so having, you know, a former student that has gone to work for the company will at least help sort of get your voice in the door, so that maybe you can go on site, make a presentation, and talk about mutual interests. So that's something I would recommend. The other thing too is to really ask questions of companies to find out what are their needs. And most companies, of course, it comes down to the bottom line, and it comes down to solving problems that, you know, eliminate bottlenecks, make delivery time quicker, reduce rejections, and so on. But oftentimes those things are really tied to underlying scientific problems. And so, you know, one thing that's important about a GOALI proposal is that it still has to be fundamental research, but in the proposal you have to communicate how that the involvement of the company partner is going to significantly increase the chances of success of this, you know, high risk, high reward proposal. But ultimately it is still about fundamental research. So from that point of view, you have to convey to the company that if we do this fundamental research and we develop new tools, techniques, results, and so on, those can ultimately be translated to help you improve your bottom line in some way. And being able to communicate that so that they see the longer term benefit without a significant risk of involvement will go a long way. But again, it takes time to build some of these relationships. So one thing I would say is, you know, don't expect something to happen overnight. And unless a company has a problem, they have you know, really high level internal scientific experts that understand exactly what you do, and what you do they think will solve their problem. But in all other cases, it does take time. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Find the common connection and the benefit for all. Agree. All right, Dr. Minari, did you have something to add?
Yeah, but the one I would add is just sometimes cold calling them, finding them. You know, you can find them and email them, they would respond. But if you do it strategically, I usually search from sbir.gov. I go to that website, I put keywords, and I put the years with filtering, so you see who won SBIR award in the last couple of years, and then you can go on the topics that are of interest, and you can find them. Some of them are next door. I found a company which are literally in Richardson that I didn't know about them. They have been there since 1987 or something, right? So just through that website. Sometimes we all know big companies, they have names and stuff, which is even more difficult to approach them. Like TI is an excellent one, but still you need to have some connection to get in. But a lot of small businesses are really willing to work with you, especially if you approach them from that side, that, you know, it's a kind of a win-win approach. If a student works in this project that is funded in GOALI, then they can come and work for you. They can intern for your company. Somehow giving them incentive to work with you. It's always challenging, but as Dr. Malik said, it's kind of a long-term, sometimes disappointment. You have to submit 1-2 times, but it will get there if both parties are interested and persistent.
Yes, it's building the long-term relationship. I agree. And we have lots of businesses around here that we can potentially find as collaborators. All right, so my next question is, do you feel like NSF has certain directorates that fund more GOALIs than others? And are there particularly industry relevant topics that they're looking for? Do you think there are any sort of I don't know, ways that they always go towards that would be helpful for the audience to know, to kind of steer their proposal that way? Let's go with Dr. Malik first.
Most of my NSF proposals go to a CMMI, which is the Civil Mechanical, you know, Directorate, and particularly in the programs that deal with manufacturing. And so there's a lot of opportunity for involvement of industry partners in those proposals. I have heard in the past from program managers that they could potentially consider a GOALI proposal let's say if it wasn't at the top of the ranking, they may be able to consider it because of the fact that it was a goalie. I really think that, I haven't heard many program managers say the same thing, just one program manager in particular, but I think it may vary. The best thing to do really is to contact the program manager and talk to them about it, and ask them, is this something that would be attractive to your program to fund? The idea itself and the strategy for involving the company partner, and then just ask for some advice and guidance on it.
Did you end up contacting your program officer before you submitted any of yours?
I'm pretty shy, so I actually probably ignore the best advice, and only the very first proposal I submitted to NSF while I was a postdoc. That was the only one I contacted the program manager, and he was the toughest guy to talk to. If anybody remembers George Hazelrig at NSF, and I was a postdoc, so I was green. I didn't know any better, so I called him, and he asked me all these tough questions, and that was the only time. And amazingly, it got funded. But I've never spoken to a program manager about a proposal, let's say, before I submit it. But I have spoken to program managers many times at conference workshops, at conferences, and those kinds of things, and try to at least find out what they're interested in. But I would recommend that anybody considering doing this definitely contact program managers.
Thank you. You must have made an impression if it got funded. All right, let's go to Dr. Minari. Do you feel like there are particular directorates or in relevant topics that a person should steer their goalie towards?
Yeah, I would emphasize the same thing that Dr. Malik mentioned. I think contacting program managers is important because, like, some inside experience from, I've been in panels that they have been goalie proposals, because these are reviewed with other proposals. It's just, this is goalie, and it comes up and you realize some of the reviewers are not really very familiar with it. Although it has been around for some time, but you'll be surprised that not many people know about it, what mechanism it is, how they should review it, what aspect to look at it. And because of that, I think you want to contact program manager to see if he has done before. He has any current funded goalies. Does he know how to handle it? Sometimes they need to know in advance so they can bring even like some industry panels and so on. I don't think particularly, I think all of them are very active, especially nowadays that NSF is moving more and more toward really technology development with the new TIP directorate. But I think all of them have instruction that they really want involvement with industry more and more. But I would always contact them, especially for goalie, so that that program manager knows what it is, what goalie is, and you'll be surprised that if some of them do not know, and some of the reviewers do not know. So you want to prepare yourself kind of for the best condition in terms of reviews with that route.
Good points. And Dr. Lee, did you have something to add?
I guess maybe my experience is a little bit different. So two of my first two goalies came from NSF ECCS, the Electronics, Communications, and Cyber Systems in the Engineering Directorate, and my current one comes from Division of Materials Research, which funds fundamental solid-state and condensed matter physics research. So those two are quite different. I think most goalie proposals go through the Engineering Directorate one way or the other in here. But in terms of program managers, I've always notified a program manager that I'm going to submit a goalie proposal, but in strictly a pro forma way in here. I have had what I would describe as drive-by program managers. I never know who my NSF program manager is in the course of 1 3-year award. I might have 3 or 4 different program managers, and they change without telling me or notifying me. So from that perspective, I've found any particular program manager to be kind of less than helpful, or at most a paper shuffler in there. I would say maybe my current one with the Division of Materials Research, they were so happy to get a goalie proposal. It's very rare in that program that anybody even bothers to submit a GOALI proposal, and I think mine was the only one in maybe the batch they got in that time frame there. And I think from talking to that program manager, mine might have been funded because it was a GOALI proposal, because certainly the topic is not trendy or hot in modern condensed matter physics here, but I think yes, I think they are under some pressure to say that they are funding work that is in collaboration with U.S. industry in here, and my proposal gave them a perfect chance to do that here. So although I'm not sure, I tend to believe my current GOALI proposal was funded because it was a rarity in the Division of Materials Research.
Yeah, you and Dr. Minari brought up a good point. With the introduction of the TIP directorate, there is a major push towards industry. So yes, GOALIs may not just be isolated events anymore. All right, our next question is, did the participant that you had on the GOALI, the students that you had, did they stay at UTD and do the work, or did they go to the company? And if they went to the company, what challenges did you experience, and what do you kind of wish you had known beforehand? Let's go with Dr. Minari first.
Yeah. Luckily for me, because it was local, we had a lot of interaction. So my student would go there for a while because the company started actually. Let's say we were doing the same work in a very smaller scale. They wanted to commercialize it. They built bigger machines, and a student would go and actually help them. It was a short drive going back and forth several times from company. Their scientists came here to my lab. So I think because of the proximity, we would do it that way. So it wasn't like a long-term going and staying there for a month and stuff, which would have happened if it was in another state or city. So that has been my experience. It's been like a day trip during the process of a couple of years.
Okay. Benefit of staying local. How about Dr. Lee? Because yours was local too, I imagine, if you had Texas Instruments as your partner. Yes,
it was all local. I would say for the students who were working on the GOALI projects, they did 95% of the research here on campus, in my laboratory at UTD. They would, we hold weekly discussions with our TI colleagues about progress and ideas and things like that. Occasionally there would be something that would need to be done at TI, and sometimes my students would then go there. But TI is a large company, and for various insurance and IP and other legal reasons, any student who goes there isn't allowed to touch anything. Okay, unless they're an actual quote unquote employee or temp. Just if they go there as a student without any official affiliation with TI, they're simply not allowed to touch anything. So often they would go sometimes to observe, maybe a TI technician do a process as part of it. I would send them there because it is also valuable for students to go meet people, okay, in there and meet the people they're working with, get some face time with TI. And I would say most of the students I've had who have worked on GOALI proposals have also done maybe a summer internship at TI, not on the GOALI project thing, but on wherever TI would have a summer internship project. And that came about because of the people they met working on the GOALI project in here, and that's always been done with my blessing. But in terms of carrying out the actual research, because I work with a large company partner, the actual research occurs here on campus.
Networking is still valuable. Still good. All right, Dr. Malik, what's your experience?
Yeah, it kind of varied. The first one, I had a graduate student go on site initially for a couple of weeks just to really get familiar with the manufacturing operations and how the products were built. And as Dr. Lee mentioned, there were some issues I didn't anticipate about, the student was not a contractor for the company, was not an employee of the company, was a grad student. So there were questions about, can this person walk around on the shop floor, and are they insured for liability in case of any accidents or something like that? And unfortunately, this is my previous institution. There was nobody that could really help me address that either. You know, how should we buy independent contractors insurance for them or something like that? So that's something I think that, you know, is never really you know, at the forefront of these until, you know, until you actually send somebody, and then the question, you know, the company may ask, are you insuring your student, you know, in our facility, again, you know, for liability and those kind of things. So that's what happened after the first few weeks, though. The student had an office at this company and spent several days there, a month. But what was really valuable was that the company was able to provide us with data that we could use to test our model predictions, and then provide advice for us on the modeling efforts and those kind of things. And so we could do a lot of that remotely. Now, with my most recent one, you know, a good chunk of it was through COVID. So we'd originally allotted several weeks for a PhD student to go on site at this company, and that it really turned into, you know, more like days than weeks, particularly in the first year or so. But it was still very valuable. The student went there and shadowed machinists and looked at the operations and discussed nuances of the technical work with the engineers there. And it was very valuable, really informing the collaborations. And then when the student came back to campus, you know, anytime we had multiple remote teleconferences, you know, and it was really good because everybody knew each other. And then it became a matter of, again, sharing data. We would ask for a machine test, and then I would send the student back up when the machine test needed to be done. The company's engineers and operators would run the test, but my student would say, hey, let's do it like this, and so on. And it worked out really well. But I think that there's one thing I'd like to add too on that is NSF has what's called intern funding. And so we actually added intern funding to this NSF GOALI that before COVID was designed to allow the PhD student to spend more time on site. But again, COVID kind of interrupted that. But that's something that I would highly recommend that PIs potentially consider is and it can be done even at the time of the award. In fact, the program manager for my case said, hey, you know, why don't you consider adding some intern funding for this? So we just wrote a supplement for it, and we got that as well.
Awesome advice. Additional funds, additional students. All right, so we're going to move on a little bit to the industry requirements of the proposal. So one of the requirements is that the industry partner has to provide a letter confirming their participation, basically. What was your experience getting that letter, and was it problematic? I imagine there are completely different experiences between TI and a smaller company. And how long do you think someone should be prepared to wait in order to get this letter, which has to go into the proposal? Let's start with you, Dr. Lee.
Okay, so yes, so this was quite different. As I said, I've had 3 over the last decade or so. I've submitted 4 GOALI proposals. 3 were funded, 1 was unsuccessful there, and so I've gotten TI to write 4 of these letters. Things have changed, I guess. Back in the early 2010s, around the first 1 or 2, I got it. This commitment letter needed to be written. Well, TI said it needed to be written by a vice president. All right, so the vice president in the management chain of my TI collaborators wrote the commitment letter. Essentially, I drafted the commitment letter, sent it to them. They brought it to their VP, who made whatever changes the VP wanted to make, then wrote the letter and signed it. But because it had to go so far up their management chain, that took a while. I'd say that took solid 3 weeks to do. But then later, maybe the 3rd proposal, they kicked it down to my colleague's manager who could write this letter. And then this last one, which was fun, the current one I have, they just said my colleague Okay, who's not a manager? He's just he's a research, he's a staff engineer there, and his manager told him he could just go ahead and write it. So they just kept coming down like that. And when my own co-PI could go ahead and write it, you know, he could do that in a day or two in there. So that's been different, and it's changed. I think this is kind of unique to TI. I have no idea how a small or medium-sized company might have to handle this.
I guess it's good that it went that way and went down,
Yeah.
and de-escalated rather than escalated.
Mhm.
All right, how about you, Dr. Malik?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, 3 weeks for me, I consider to be a short time. Dr. Lee, you mentioned it took 3 weeks. Yeah, I actually, you know, this is something that I would start at the very beginning. Let's say if you plan over a few months to write a proposal, start the conversation early, not just on the letter, but also on the other documents required, biosketches and those kind of things, and especially on the IP, which we'll talk about later, I know. But my experience, I've always worked with small businesses, so fewer than 500 employees generally, and this is perhaps some, you know, advice based on my own experience. I think if you're working with a large company and they're familiar with your institute, with UTD, and they're familiar with your work, it might not be so difficult. But my experience is working with large companies, things tend to move slower. There's more bureaucracy, especially when it gets to the legal side. So I've always preferred goalies with small businesses, because oftentimes the technical leadership can just walk down the hallway and go to the legal counsel or the executive leadership and say, we want to do this. And rather than a full-fledged formal ROI analysis, they have a meeting and say, why you want to do this, and what's it going to cost us, and what's the risk, and so on, and then they sort of settle it there, and then they go, okay, well, we'll sign off on it. But yeah, I mean, every company will require some kind of ROI, you know, but how extensive it is, I think, is related to the size of the company, and so that's just some. But so my letters. Like Dr. Lee, I sort of put some bullet points in there and said, this is what I like to do. And they were mainly, you know, this was, as Dr. Minari mentioned, you know, the goal is prior to now, there was no funding that was received by the company. So the commitment from the company was sort of in-kind labor and machine time and those kind of things. And I sort of outlined what I would like to see in terms of being able to do the research, put it in bullet point format, and then let the company, you know, sort of massage the language. And then, you know, I would say, I need this back, you know, by middle of next month, and that's it. You know, we'd go from there.
All right, and how about you, Dr. Minari?
Yeah, I think not much to add other than I think the draft is important. We should understand that in the GOALI is still, you know, the incentive on the company side may not be that enough. And we should know that they also, one of them becomes co-PI in the proposal, their name goes on there, they receive all the emails for annual report, your annual report is due, past due, and all that. So knowing that they go through a lot without really getting much. So you should do your homework as a PI from university side to provide them the letter, provide them the incentive things that they need, and give them a lot of time to kind of discuss whatever they need to do. So I would say, again, unless you're your third, second, and so on, you really plan a month or even advance, because you may have to go through several drafts to get it done.
Excellent advice. All right, so the program requires that there be an IP agreement between the university and the industry sponsor. And so, Dr. Malik, I know that you have some pleasant and not pleasant experiences with this. So we'll go to you first, so you can give us your challenges and your hurdles and how you overcame them.
Yeah, so I would say, as with any NSF proposal, you know, start with really carefully reading the solicitation, you know, and the policies and procedures to understand what is required and what is not required. So in an NSF GOALI, typically an IP agreement between the industry partner and the university is not required for submission, but it's required before an award can be made. So typically what most proposers probably do, I'm guessing, is you might get a boilerplate, you know, a template for an IP agreement from the university, and then just sort of attach that, and then you put some words in the you know, this is the IP agreement that we'll sign upon award or something. And most IP agreements, you know, between a university and a company, the standard is whoever invents owns, and if there's shared invention, there's shared ownership. And this is where it gets really tricky, because a lot of companies, small companies especially, that are really sort of trying to pursue pioneering technology, they're very understandably very protective of their technology. And considering the fact that, you know, NSF doesn't care whether we are supporting as PhD students, for example, US citizens, permanent residents, or international students, sometimes it can be quite sensitive to the company in terms of, well, you know, how are we going to be affected by you know, any generation of research, whether it really has strong IP potential or strong commercialization potential or not. So I think it's really good to discuss this up front with the company and educate yourselves first before you do, and then, you know, mention to them that there's this thing called the Bayh-Dole Act, you know, that came around a long time ago, where the federal government is actually very generous now, that in that it you know, when it you know, awards a federal contract through NSF, for example, that it allows the recipients of the grant to basically retain the IP rights rather than the federal government retaining the IP rights. And that has allowed for far more commercialization of research, you know, in the last couple of decades than previously. So this is a really great thing. And companies oftentimes don't really see it that way until you explain it to them. But the other thing is that it's really important to have an understanding of the IP before you submit the proposal, because otherwise you will run into the mistake I made, where, you know, we got a recommendation from the program manager, and the program manager said, I want to fund it, just send me the signed IP agreement, but we hadn't signed the IP agreement. And then when it came to sign it, the company said, well, we want all the IP, and we were okay with it as scientists, because for us it was about basic research. It wasn't about generation of commercialization, you know, IP. But at the same time, of course, the universities have to agree to it. In this case, not everybody agreed to it, so it wasn't funded, which was very unfortunate. Now, but keep in mind also that, you know, when we originally discussed IP with the company, with the partner, they weren't on the sort of you know, superstar growth that they were on 6 months later, when the award was, I mean, when the proposal was being recommended. And so at that time they said, well, you know, we now feel that we really have to protect our IP, or any future IP, and so that's why they really said that they didn't want to go with a standard IP agreement. So so the rules are, you know, educate yourself first on what it all means, and try to explain to the company how it works. And again, if you review the Bayh-Dole Act, that has really allowed for much freer generation and commercialization of IP, and explain it to the company, I think it will really be helpful for them to understand it. And then the third thing is just make sure the company understands that without a signed IP agreement in place, there will be no award. It will just, even if it's recommended, then the program manager will go to the next one on the list, and that's what happened to us. Let's see, the one thing I would say about IP agreements, though, too, is that they can be changed at any time. So typically a company or a university with advance notice can change them. So even if a company does agree, they can change later on. But NSF doesn't really care what's in the IP agreement or how you manage it. All they care is that they get a signed one before the award is made. So that's the good news, is, you know, if something goes downhill later on, it probably won't affect the award in the same way. Hopefully that wasn't too much information, but my experience.
No, that was perfect. And you bring up a good point that while it's not required at the proposal, you really should go down that path and if possible, get it signed so that there aren't any problems and so that you haven't written this wonderful proposal and almost had the award, but then you can't just because of one simple agreement. If you iron it out up front, then you don't have to worry about that. Dr. Minari, did you have anything to add on this topic or were your experiences all easy?
No, my experience was okay, but I remember, if I'm not confusing, I think we have a one standard allocation of rights or something, so that I prefer to start with that even for SBI or other ones, from send our version to them, and if they agree to that, it's much easier rather than wait for them to send us something. But also sometimes I think being realistic helps in a way that you consider if you really think that this thing gonna be really fundamental science and most probably not gonna end up in being any IP patent and so on. I think if you put that one up front there is a language somewhere that you don't expect to that. It would make it easier from both sides, because sometimes you just do science and you know that it's not going to end up being any commercial value at that point or patent. I think that makes easy for both sides in my experience. But I really did not have a bad experience in the cases I've worked with companies.
Good. Yes, and we do have a standard template that lays out exactly the rules that Dr. Malik talked about, the yours, mine, and ours clause, where whatever inventor invents it, go with it. And so that is the best place to start because those are the university-friendly terms, and then we can work out from there and try and get to a middle ground with the company if they are concerned. So Dr. Lee, what was your experience?
I guess, again, because I work with TI, I didn't have any particular trouble. TI has so many IP agreements with UTD of various sorts. And I guess the first GOALI proposal I wrote, TI, I had gotten some funding from TI through the Semiconductor Research Corporation. And so there was an existing allocation of rights agreement covering that funding between TI and SRC and me. So I simply included a copy of that as an example in the proposal itself. And then when it got recommended for funding and I needed to get an actual signed one, well, I guess it turns out that our IP people are on a first name basis with TI's IP people. And so that just was not an issue. And then every succeeding one, when I submit the proposal, I just include as an example the previous IP proposal. And I just say that basically, if the proposal is recommended for funding, we're just going to change the name of the project in this, and everybody's going to sign it again. And that's what happens. So.
Yes, it does help when we have the pre-existing long-standing relationship. All right, so our final question is for Dr. Minari. So you had mentioned that your GOALI proposal led to an SBIR and STTR. So I wanted you to give us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, I think it has been multiple. Again, it's like the kind of incentive for the company, knowing that probably before they didn't get anything out of GOALI directly, and now you get a third of it. But eventually, no matter what, the SBIR, STR, phase 1 can be a small 200K, but phase 2 can go 1.2, 1 million, 1.2 million for 2 years, which can be a big, like a large incentive for a company to do that. And I think it's a path that I think it's good to bring it up while you are working on your IP agreement, on a GOALI proposal, and letters saying that, hey, if we are successful in this, there are going to be more things that are going to benefit the company. And I think in that regard, for me at least, has been a good experience to provide that incentive to the company. Obviously, it's a little bit of a kind of a different mechanism. It's more of applied work, but it helps in terms of building trust, building relationship, and continuing doing things while maybe your goal is ended or you are waiting for the next one, kind of fill up the gap in between. So in that case, I kind of highly recommend in looking at it, because the companies that they also have experience with SBIRs, or they have done one or many of them, they are also more familiar with this type of languages. They know how things work, how the grants work, how the IP works, what's the experience of working with a university professor, for example. One of the things that the company that I work with, he said, like, I've worked with several professors, but I think you understand our language, you know, better because I've worked with so many of them. Because you cannot just go, I mean, we are scientists, we do fundamental science, but if you just do that, they have no interest, right? The company wants to make money, so you have to learn how to speak in their language. And it's the other way around too. If they have worked with university on SBIR, STTRs, a lot of these things are easier for them. When you tell them that, oh, you're going to be a co-PI on this grant, your name going to go there, or send me your 2-page bio sketch. If they have never done it, then it's going to be a big trouble. So finding those, I think it would help you finding companies that they are active in SBIRs, SCTR, working with with university. They will understand your language better, and I think you'll have a better success in terms of GOALI project or the other ones.
Yeah, you have to find the common language and show the commitment long term. Good points. All right, so the final thoughts are, is there anything that you wish you had known prior to your GOALI proposal that you would like to let the audience know about? Any words of wisdom that they can take with them? Let's start with you, Dr. Malik.
Yeah, I've just taken it back to the IP and how important that is, and making sure that everybody understands that this is a key document that is needed, and give it plenty of time for negotiation and discussion, and make sure everybody understands that if it's not signed, then even if the project is recommended, it won't get funded. Yep.
Good words of advice. And how about you, Dr. Lee?
Yeah, I don't know about my own experiences here, but several people have asked me about GOALI proposals. So this tends to be, from the world of more fundamental science rather than engineering. And so people who think that maybe if they submit a GOALI proposal, that they'll have a higher chance of getting funded, which may or may not be true. I don't know what the statistics are, but a lot of them actually ask me how important it is to have a true collaboration with the industry partner. They are actually seeking to get an industry partner, I would say, in name only. They have this idea they want to do in here. They think they might stand a better chance of getting funded if they have a pro forma or in name only industry partner, and so that's kind of what they're seeking to do. And I've always told anyone thinking about that, probably the GOALI route is not the best route for that kind of thing. That they really do want a true collaboration, okay, where the work could not get done without the regular participation from your industrial partner. So your industrial co-PI is a true co-principal investigator, not somebody who's just going to send you their bio and stuff and then wash their hands of it in there. So I guess my best advice would be, yes, find something of mutual interest where both sides will contribute something to the success of whatever research there, and that makes the best kind of GOALI, both proposal and project. Okay.
And Dr. Minari?
Yeah, I think not much to add. Again, I think as the solicitation says, the industry partner, they really have to provide a critical research expertise. So you really need to find someone that they provide an expertise that you don't have, and as they say, without it, proposal would not succeed. For example, in my case, project involved electroplating, and when I talked to this person, he showed me patents were hanging from his wall. Now he has like 75. Before, when I talked to him, he had 50. He said like 15 of my patents are on electroplating. So I know a lot about this. So I've called him many times when I have question, I ask, shows different direction. So you really want to find someone that they have, that critical expertise. And also, I think that the problem has to come from industry, as they have written here, that you are solving a problem that industry have interest, not if you just start from yourself and say, now you give me a letter, probably that's not going to work. Somewhere it will show up in the proposal or in review stuff. So you really have to, I would say, give it a year ahead of time, build relationship with them, talk to them and see what really need they have. And together, come up with an idea that both parties are excited, rather than you write your proposal and say, okay, let's add one paragraph that this company is partner. Probably that would not fly.
Yes, much more of a collaboration rather than just a support letter. It needs to be all combined and integrated. Well, excellent conversation. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Lee, Dr. Malik, and Dr. Minari. I appreciate you taking the time to tell us about your experience.
Right. Thank
Pleasure
you. It was
to
a
be
pleasure.
here.
No, it's a pleasure. Yeah, happy to do it.
All right. Thank you for sharing your time and talent with the audience, Dr. Lee, Dr. Malik, Dr. Minari, and Emily Lacey. Audience, thank you for joining us today. Stay abreast of upcoming Office of Research and Innovation programs by following us on social media and subscribing to our newsletter. Next up, Hanover Career Development Mid-Stage Webinar on Tuesday, February 21st at 12 p.m. Consider joining us. This information and a polite request to complete a brief survey about today's program can be found in the chat. Have a nice afternoon.